Hi everyone, this is Gurpreet. I'm director of Radical Desi, which is an online magazine that covers alternative politics. I'm delighted to announce today we are joined by Hartosh Pal, a very senior journalist based in New Delhi. He's the political editor of the Carbon magazine. He has been following the farmers' agitation very closely, has been writing consistently about it. He has also been writing thoroughly about the growing attacks on religious minorities and political dissidents in India under Modi. It's very unfortunate that he was scheduled to speak at SFU event tomorrow, which is not happening because some so-called Sikh activists they were upset with Hartosh. The very fact that he happens to be the nephew of KPS Gill is a big problem for them. They are also upset with the fact that he has written some articles in relation to Mr. Gill, which they don't agree with. But that's not the way. I mean, despite those disagreements, he should have been given an opportunity to speak because he has been covering the farmers' agitation very closely as a thorough journalist. And unfortunately, UBC had planned a similar event in April, on April of 7th. That was also cancelled because of the pressure coming from the same group. It's a shame that these universities couldn't stand up for what we say freedom of press and also the academic freedom. Very, very unfortunate. So they are hearing the voices of those a bunch of self-styled community gatekeepers, which is very, very unfortunate. That's the reason why Radical Desi took upon itself to host this uh, online conversation. And I'm delighted to announce that we have been joined by some journalist friends who actually covered this issue very thoroughly. Briefly about Hartosh. Hartosh is the editor of political editor of the Carbon magazine, and also my association with him goes back to what we say mid 90s. We worked together with Indian Express, and I have seen Hartosh working as honest journalist, a man with integrity. Despite being nephew of KPS Gill, he was covering the cases of the unclaimed bodies and the people who have been uh, what we say campaigning for the justice to those who were killed in extrajudicial manner. So he was giving voice to them through his work without uh, any kind of compromise. So I mean, I'm also willing to mention here the first time I met those people, those activists who were investigating the unclaimed bodies case was at Hartosh rented accommodation in Chandigarh. So the very fact that they were there with all those documents and he was doing a story on these things, I mean, how can people ignore it? It's very unfortunate that they have completely glossed over the entire body of his work for all these years. He has been vocal against the draconian laws. He has been vocal against the repression on minorities and the political dissidents. Despite that, very conveniently, these people overlooked his good work, and they're just trying to nail him for his position on Mr. KPS Gill. So, without taking much of your time, I'm going to ask some questions to Hartosh. So, the format is in the first half, I will be asking some questions, and once we are done, then we will encourage the participants to raise some questions at the end of the conversation. So, Hartosh, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Hartosh, how do you assess the current situation in India under the right-wing Hindu nationalist regime?
Look, I think, Gurpreet, we have ourselves on radio spoken several times about this. I've written about it constantly. From 2014 onwards, things have gone from bad to worse. But the second term from 2019 has exacerbated things. There's a complete clampdown. I mean, we have reached the position today that I think it would not be fair to call India a constitutional democracy. In that sense, I'm not questioning the democratic mandate for Modi. People have supported him. Let's not be in doubt about that. But what is happening is the constitutional democracy functions on the principles of a constitution with certain guarantees in the constitution, the checks and balances that must exist through judiciary and other institutions with the free media. None of that today is working the way it should be working in India. In the absence of these institutional safeguards, basically we have unchecked mobocracy and autocracy through the ballot. And this mobocracy does not tolerate dissent, differences, questioning. It has come down harshly by any means possible to stop this. Whether it is activists who are raising questions, whether it is minorities, or whether it is journalists. This is our current state in India.
Now, what are some of the most pressing issues at this very moment, which you think the world must pay attention to?
Look, right now, where I'm sitting in Delhi, and it's true of much of India today. The most pressing issue is, of course, we are in the middle of the biggest COVID crisis anywhere in the world.
Hmm.
And this is a crisis of not of India's making, but of Mr. Modi's making. That, of course, that the virus would hit every country is a given. But that we've had a year and a half to prepare, to build up capacity, to build up hospitals, to build up ventilators, to build up oxygen capacity. In this 1.5 years, apart from rhetoric, we have seen no action from the Modi government. The Modi government was announcing victory over the virus 2 months ago. It was not stocking up on essentials. Today, people are dying for lack of oxygen. That is unforgivable. It's not even ventilators of hospital beds. People who have got into hospital, the lucky few who got into hospital, are today dying because oxygen cannot be supplied. What else is happening? That people who are dying at home because they can't get admitted to hospitals are not being counted as COVID victims. So the death toll that you're hearing, the number of cases is exaggerated, is being undercounted by a huge amount. Already India has the most cases, daily cases of any place in the world over a period of time.
Right.
But the number of cases has probably been underestimated by a huge number. So you can see the extent of the crisis and the failure of the Modi leadership right now. This is happening in the background of, we've seen over the past year and a half, citizenship protests against the NRC, where particularly the Muslim minority has felt targeted and alienated. We are in the middle of the biggest farm protests the world has ever seen, and the government has not responded to them. All around, there are activists, again, part of a large demonstration and assertion of Dalit rights in Bhima Koregaon, who've been jailed under fabricated charges. And the evidence is out that these charges have been fabricated by government agencies. All that has been written about in the Indian press, in Caravan, in the foreign media, that the forensics don't stand to evidence. This is where we are. And the government at this point of time, without wanting to engage with criticism, is trying to suppress it and shut it down.
Pratush, coming back to the COVID situation, especially in terms of the shortage of oxygen cylinders or oxygen, how does it reflect on these tall claims of development and progress under Modi? Because this image of Modi was being sold widely when he was running for the office, that he might bring in Gujarat model all across India. And there was a myth about Gujarat model itself. So tell us something about that. I mean, how does it reflect on these tall claims of the development and progress?
See, in fact, what he has done is exactly that. He has introduced the Gujarat model to the rest of the country. What was the Gujarat model? It basically involved dismantling of the public health structure. It involved the dismantling of public education. It meant the marginalization of the Muslim minorities. And it meant the withdrawal of governance from various important sectors of the Indian economy, and a lot of privileges to few private players like Adani, who are very close to Modi, whose career has risen in parallel with Mr. Modi's career. And this is where we are today in the rest of the country. We are seeing what has happened because of the lack of investment in public health and the ability to not, the government today is not in a position because it has not planned to be in a position to actually help people when they most need it. And so what Mr. Modi has done is today taken us back to 60 or 70 years when India is emerging as a post-independent nation with few resources, that in moments of crisis, we have to go around with a begging bowl to the US, to the UK, counter to the great claims Mr. Modi was making, asking for help, groveling in some senses, at a time, look, we are 50 years from Bangladesh. At a time 50 years ago, India was dealing with humanitarian crisis in Bangladesh. Today, India is a bigger crisis than Bangladesh was, or nearly to that scale. And this is entirely a failure of governance. It is not that India lacked the capacity to be dealing with crisis if governance had planned for it.
Of course, we have learned that this government is more concerned about its image problem worldwide. How frustrating is that? And how this makes your work rather more difficult and challenging?
Look, I mean, its concern with image problems is huge. First of all, that it should be so concerned when almost all the mainstream media, the major television channels, all the major newspapers are already echoing the government line. The government is not getting questioned. Recently, I myself reported on a government of India, a report prepared by various ministers, which focused on literally targeting journalists who are critics. There are people close to this government who are quoted in that report saying that we should color code journalists. Uh, Journalists who are opponents of this government should be labeled with a certain code, that we should plant stories through favorable journalists, that we should isolate the ones who are critical, that we should pay basically propaganda channels on the private. This is all part of a government of ministers report released by the government. So the fact is that the number of critical media outlets, maybe 1 or 2% that remain, are still bothering the government so much that they are focusing all their resources on government communication entirely into suppressing these voices, whether on Twitter, on social media. There's been a crackdown. During this current crisis itself, tweets which are critical of the government and posting facts which examine the government's record have been pulled down and taken down, not because they seem to be wrong, but because the government doesn't like them. And Twitter has
Right.
been in no position to resist. Twitter tried resisting it. Their executives were threatened with arrest. That is what happened.
Now, this country has seen the press censorship and emergency in the past. But what is so unique about this government when it comes to journalistic freedom?
Look, the emergency lasted for a year, year and a half. The censorship was crude. The newspapers, parts of the newspapers were literally censored, but everybody knew what was going on, and it did not have mass support. There was media resisting it. Today, what we are seeing is the complicity of large parts of the Indian population and institutions in what is happening with the media. So in that sense, what we are seeing is the willing consent to autocratic mob rule in this country. And in that, because journalism in the end survives on a public space in which people respond to journalism, amplify it, and ask questions of the government. Today, through social media and the kind of pressures the government is creating, we've turned into a situation where journalistic questions about the government and turned around and become questions about the journalists themselves. This is a convenient way of silencing journalists when you turn around. Why are they doing this story? What is their interest? What is their motive? So rather than respond to the stories that are being done, it becomes a point at which you question journalists, you question the organizations they are working for, and you clamp down on them.
Right. So now I'm going to walk into a different territory. I won't be doing my job if I don't raise these questions.
No.
How would you like to address the issue of two major universities of Canada denying you an opportunity to speak on farmers' education due to pressure from the Sikh activists?
Well, look, I mean, in some senses, it connects up with the past question you just asked. That what does the Modi government do when they don't want you to speak on a certain issue? They question, basically, it is what we call whataboutery. He's doing this story. Did he do that story on the Congress at that point? It's another matter that I did stories on the Congress. He's speaking on issue A. What did he say on issue B? Is he writing on this? What did he say about the Pandits in 1993? You see, so the issue at hand that is to be addressed is silenced by invoking the past history of 70 years, where you can pick out any incident you want and use it as a way of silencing whoever is speaking, because they have not represented what is seen as the popular view in accordance with that on every issue at every point of time. Nobody will be able to live up to those standards. You can discredit anybody you want by doing this. That two universities should fall for this without even understanding what is at stake, without seeing that there is an opportunity to discuss and talk about these issues. If there is a question, first of all, and I'll come straight to the issue, how can academic freedom in this sense be pre-decided? One, I did not go seeking these occasions to speak in Canada. I mean, the farm protests and what happened with the farm protests do not get decided by what anybody in Canada thinks of the farm protests. It was a point of reaching out and talking about what is happening in India, an opportunity, and I said yes. And then I find there is this controversy and they have withdrawn. So I do not understand what the university itself was thinking, what their thinking was behind. Uh, now, as far as the question that comes up is my 2017 article on KPSK. Now, who has made this an issue? And I'll come back and address that issue as well. I've spoken about the farm protests in India and universities. I've spoken abroad on various occasions. I've written about the farm protests. The focus has been on the farm protests. Has any of this been used by me or anybody as an opportunity to highlight KPS Gill or to make the issue about KPS Gill? How does KPS Gill become an issue? Not out of my choosing. I want the focus on the farm protests. I have the credentials to write about the farm protests. I have written about it. This is what the university wanted to discuss. This is very like the Modi government that, okay, but on that issue, on that particular date, you said something that we are not sure we agree with, but they don't know what they disagree with either. It's the same thing. The Modi government can turn around and tell me that, but you know, in 1993 on that issue, you said something we don't agree with. How dare you speak again today? In that sense, the autocracy of dissent works in the same way. The use of power works in the same way. They want to disagree with me. I've said I will address any questions you want to ask. You may not like my view, but first interact with it and try and find out what my view is and ask me any questions. I'll answer them. Where is the issue?
Just for the record, now you were asked to specifically talk about the farmers issue. This had nothing to do with the human rights abuse in Punjab or KPS Gill.
Sure. There was, look, this was about the farm protests going on here. There was no mention of any other subject. Whatever in the larger sense connected up with the farm protests was part of this conversation. That is all. That is what I was meant to speak about on the 3 specific farm laws that have been enacted by the Modi government, the history of farm protests. And this is a protest that is far wider than the issue of a few Sikhs in Canada. This is even in the Indian sense, a national protest. It is not a community protest. It is not a Sikh protest. The strange thing was that I think in the end, the university finally issued a letter that this has been postponed and they will choose people that the Sikh and Punjabi community in Canada approves of. Now, this imagined community, I don't know how they decide who the Sikh community in Canada is, who speaks for it. I think deliberately the use of the word Punjabi in this context is a deliberate lie. The difference between Punjabi opinion and Sikh opinion is huge itself. And Sikh opinion, I mean by the few hardliners who claim to speak for Sikh opinion, is huge. So the university is first of all lying when they see. Second, who do they decide represents the Sikh community? Do they go sample it and take a vote on any issue? Tomorrow, if somebody is going to come and speak on whichever issue you choose about in India, that we are going to talk, the farm protests are an Indian issue. Tomorrow we are talking of suppression of dissent by the Modi government. Is the university going to go and seek votes from the Modi government to decide who can best address the Modi government's dissidents in India? On what basis does the university operate in such a climate? Does it not virtually amount to basically this, that you need some money to run some chairs in your departments, you are dependent on funding, and for that funding, you are willing to compromise in any measure possible. It's not very different from what we see with the media in India. You trace the funding and you see the kind of pressures and you see the kind of compromises that result. And I think maybe Canadians don't realize what this means at the moment because it seems like a limited concern far outside their day-to-day life. But this ability to control and censor universities through funding pressures without actually examining issues in the public domain has huge large-scale dangers. We in India already know what happens when it gets carried to an excess and you don't check it when it needs to check.
Absolutely. Now, being an objective journalist, do you see any rationale behind this opposition?
Well, look, it's simply that I can understand they do not agree. They have huge problems with my views of KPS. Well, I can come back to why I think that is the case. But is that an opposition they want to engage with? Are those questions they want to ask me or address? Are they, for example, a lot of them have Khalistani predilections. Some others speak in the name of human rights, but I have never seen them speak about in India contextually what is happening in Kashmir, what is happening in anywhere else, what is happening in the rest of the country. so for them, human rights seem to be limited to what happens in the Sikh community. So they are not speaking in the name of human rights. These are people who carry the badge of Bhindranwale and speak of human rights. A man who's targeted Hindu minorities, migrants from the rest of the country, who let, again, a reign of terror. You cannot take up one banner and claim to speak for another banner. So they have a problem with my point of view. So then the third thing, there is a huge number of people who feel the past in Punjab must always be open to question. And I think that's very important. How must that be open to question? They talk about truth and reconciliation as a basis forward. Now, but truth and reconciliation does not mean that their truth and everybody else must reconcile to it. That truth must start with an honesty in the beginning where every side speaks the truth about what happened in Punjab. Reconciliation begins with that understanding. If they want that truth and reconciliation consists of what they've decided is the truth and everybody must follow suit, that is not truth and reconciliation. Nothing is going to come out of it. And this is what I said, that this is where they do not want to discuss, they want to impose. And I think that always comes about when you have an intellectual paucity and an ability not to argue or discuss the issue at hand.
Now, to what extent you think this opposition has actually benefited Modi government and its apologists in Canada, considering their discomfort with what you have been writing for the Carbon?
Look, Gurpreet, you are in a better position to answer this question. As far as I'm concerned, the simple matter is that there is nothing better that Modi government or anybody would like than to stop anybody who's a critic and who has a rational argument on the farm protests and is willing to take aside the economic basis for how the farm laws are framed, not in terms of some conspiracy theory, but with actual illustrations. I can safely say that in terms of Adani's involvement and how Adani stands to benefit from these farm laws, I think the single reason cogent piece, not as a conspiracy that Adani is close to Modi, but looking at the ground and laying out the infrastructure that Adani has on the ground, Adani's involvement with procurement, and how immediately if the farm laws are passed, the single biggest beneficiary immediately will be the Adani company, is the piece I have written where it is documented, everything is written down, where Adani stands is put out. It is not rhetoric that because Modi is close to Adani, it is based on factual positions on the ground. This is the kind of argument that the Modi government doesn't like, because you cannot counter it by rhetoric, because it's based on facts on the ground. You don't want these things coming out. You don't want these things spoken about. Of course, the silence suits them. And I'm not saying that the two people are hand in glove, but I think certain phenomena have similarity. Religious fundamentalism, religious majoritarianism, to speak, the idea of Khalistan mirrors the idea that Modi proposes. What is it? Is the idea of one community, one faith reigning dominant and marginalizing everybody else. And we saw this during the period of Sikh militancy or terror, whatever you want to call it, which always was a Sikh minority very much in Punjab. The Hindus internally migrated, many were chased out of Punjab, migrant Hindus were targeted, people they did not like were murdered. In that sense, with the gun, they did very similar things to what Mr. Modi is doing through the ballot and the power. It's that Mr. Modi is far more dangerous than even a Bhindranwale, because he ends up controlling the state. Bhindranwale had to fight against the state. A minority terror ends up, the minority fundamentalism ends up taking arms and weapons. Majority fundamentalism ends up taking over the state. That's the basic difference. But as phenomenons and what they represent, there is a huge similarity.
Now, Tosh, since you have been writing against majoritarianism politics of the previous Congress regime,
sure,
and have been making connection between the past and the present,
sure,
and how the so-called secularist regime had laid
sure,
ground for Modi, say
sure,
by engineering Sikh pogrom, Operation Blue Star. So how you look back at the role of your uncle in history more dispassionately and critically, as he was a spoke in the wheel of repression?
So let me just point out what the argument I made and what my article is, because it's easy to set up a straw man and say, this is what I've said. What does the argument? That if you scapegoat the question of human rights violations in one person in Punjab, you are not dealing with the problem. Yeah. What happens in Punjab? KPS Gill is a police officer. There's a large state machinery that is active. He comes in at a certain point of the Punjab police already exists as a force. There's a conflict going on. That human rights violations are systemic in Punjab and across the country, and the police behaves in a certain manner, is something we all know and we constantly continue to write about. And it will not go away till we deal with it in systemic fashion. Yeah. So what happens? KPS Gill comes to Punjab. What I point out is that this is the middle of a conflict. What we call encounters do not go up under his period. He's using the same police methods as his predecessor. Ribeiro is using, Amangat is using, what the army continues to raise across. So what I'm saying is that militancy ends under this period cannot be accounted for by the use of these methods. At no point do I see these methods should ever be used. The reality is the system continues to. Whatever he ends up succeeding with has nothing to do with these methods in some senses, because if these methods are what work, they are common across the board to all police officers. For that, I use some comparative data. They said that data is biased, but when I use comparisons between one phase of the Punjab police and another phase of the Punjab police, if there's a bias, comparative statistics still hold true because the bias is systemic across the board. That does not change the argument I'm making. That's the first argument. That in the second, I said that we must then deal with the actual extent and rights issues, which is tremendous. And at that point, and this gets their goat even more, is the question of the Khalra's numbers of 25,000. And here I say this 25,000 is not statistically justifiable. Why is it not statistically? I say the field work that Khalra did was excellent. 2,049 disappearances, unidentified cremations. And I know the people who've done this work. These are people we have met together, Sarabjit, Rajiv Randhawa, Kadyala. All these are people that know this is excellent field work on the ground. This is from Amritsar, Taran and Gurdaspur, the three worst affected. So from 2049, how do we go to 20? You multiply it by all the police districts in Punjab. You can't take the worst affected police district in Punjab, the worst affected, and multiply it by districts. Abhor Fazilka does not have 2,049 deaths. Kapurthala does not have 2,049 deaths. Mohali does not have 2,049 deaths. You cannot multiply it by 12 and get to the figure. I said the figure should come to be 7,000 and 8,000, which is not defensible either. And this is a period from, I think, roughly 83, 84 to 93. You will get a figure of 7,000, 8,000. Since then, field work in Punjab by INSAF and by Satnam Bains has come up with a similar figure of 7,000 or 8,000. And I said that we must pursue the truth by what the truth is. You cannot exaggerate figures by another 20,000 to suit a narrative. That narrative is strong enough even without. These were the two important points I made in that article that they have a huge problem with. What I said is that their opposition to KPS Gill, specifically as an individual, is born out of this fact that he actually ended in finishing off this movement, the violent movement. The problem they have is not with systemic human rights violations, because otherwise then we would be pursuing cases against Ribeiro, against Mangat, against the Indian Army, and the continuation of these problems across the board in Kashmir and the rest of India. In UP, as we speak today, in peacetime, the police is carrying out more police encounters than was happening in Punjab at the point of time. If you think that all of it will go away because you will hold one KPS Gill liable, that is not going to happen. And that is my point, that it is easy to make a scapegoat because that becomes the most visible reference, but that is a denial of the truth of what is going on. These were the 2 points I made. Now, one can disagree with the conclusions, one can disagree with what I'm saying, but the facts that I've set out need to be engaged with. And then if people feel that this is an error I made here in terms of numbers and conclusions, then feel free and I will discuss it and argue it out. And at no point do I feel that it is justifiable for even a single deviation from what is constitutionally to be done as policing in this country.
But as you just mentioned about the situation in Uttar Pradesh under Yogi Adityanath government, you have been critical of anti-terror laws being selectively applied on Muslims and political dissidents. But when your uncle was the Punjab police chief, the then infamous anti-terror law, TADA, was too being selectively applied on the Sikhs at that time. Have you tried to examine his complicity in the police atrocities committed back then and how it had set the precedent for current state violence.
Sure. As I said, the history of political violence by the state in India has a long history. Well before what happened in Punjab, TADA was already in operation before KPS bill comes to Punjab. The very people who are today talking mostly in Panthic terms about the extent of human rights violation, the first big assault and the use of the police to encounter policing took place under a Panthic government led by his father in the early 70s against the Naxals of the communists. Yeah. At that time, it was again systemic. So what I'm saying is there is a police force that is inherited. I'm only trying to place it in context. I think every officer is accountable, command responsibility is accountable. But if you are going to pick out one person and say, this is the person responsible for it, then I'm only placing it in context that what was being done at that point of time is the norm of policing in this country. Does that make him accountable? Yes, it makes everybody who was in that system accountable, including him accountable. But I am trying to point out that the end of this violent movement that came did not come through such methods. That is my single point. I am not defending at any point the use of these methods, these laws, or that. But what I am saying is that there were other characteristics to him as a police leader, which led to the end of the movement, which had nothing to do with what is usually, if these methods could work so successfully, there would be no insurgencies, militancies existing anywhere in the country at any point of time. This is my simple argument. Now, people feel that that is a cop-out way, but I'm saying this is the reality of the situation on the ground there. If you think today that a single police officer will walk into a situation and clean up the Indian police and not be part of this process, it's not true. Every IPS officer walking into a police force in the country is dealing in such methods on a regular basis today. And the systemic cleanup will not go off by picking those individual officers and saying they are accountable. This will go away only when we recognize that this whole state and a large part of us as a country are complicit in what is happening with policing and with every other institution in terms of how operations are carried out. We have to deal with the systemic violation of human rights that exists every day. You walk with me to South Delhi, the most liberal part of the country. You walk into every police station. We've reported in police stations. There's a torture room in every police station. Torture is absolutely forbidden. The same people who make a hue and cry of human rights are people who will say when their maid, something is stolen at their house, will say that please extort whatever you can, get information. This widespread use of terror across the country at the level at which it is happening enjoys widespread support and complicity. What I'm saying is if we want to reform the system, work with it, these are issues that we need to take up on a daily basis. Encounters, torture, a system that continues to operate with this. This will not go away by saying that one person, A, B, C, are responsible. It is not that. This is a complicity that goes up right to the top in our system, and everybody who's held positions of power is responsible. There is a command response.
Now, first, you have also been critical of sexual violence, particularly the gendered violence committed by the Indian forces in a conflict zone like Kashmir.
Sure.
While most media outlets in India either look away or they try to rationalize such crimes in the name of national interest. So how do you look back at the conviction of Mr. Gill in famous Rupandur Bajaj case? And the way media houses try to push the story under the rug for the sake of so-called national interest back then?
I have not ever offered any justification or defense for that. There was a conviction, there was a court trial, and I think that is where things stand. I have offered no defense on that score in the least. And I think going on from there to any kind of sexual violence that involves in terms of police forces across the country is unjustified in any case.
And to what extent the image of Mr. Gill as a super cop, quote unquote super cop, being sold by the media back then, because you are with the media, that's why I'm asking you.
Sure.
So how this kind of labeling or branding actually gave legitimacy to the police violence?
Sure. Look, as I said, the legitimacy to the police violence did not happen just with the media. There's a large scale support across the citizenry in this country for police violence. There's a sanction which is ingrained into our system. And yes, the glorification of people at certain points of time only strengthens that factual position. But what I am saying is two different things. That this glorification, this addressal by the media, this focus is actually not the issue that was at stake in Punjab in terms of the militancy, that you cannot just attribute a super status to one person and then wish away what happened. And that is why I continue to say, and which is why even today I say this field work that Insaf is doing, that Satnam Bens is doing, and we have interviewed, reported on this in the Khalra case itself, that in the end, the only counter to this will not be the rhetorical arguments. When I turn back to Punjab and talk about Adani, it is fieldwork on the ground that accumulates evidence and builds up cases. And that work on the ground has to be done. And that Satnam Bens and all are doing that work today. And accumulating that evidence, I think, is one of the vital things in terms of finding out the truth of what happened during that period of time, the culpability and responsibility, and then facing up to the fact that the truth and reconciliation of that period will only come about when we understand the systemic culpability in the violence of everybody involved in what was going on at that point of time in Punjab.
Let's move out of Punjab for a bit.
Sure.
When the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi was accused of engineering anti-Muslim massacre in Gujarat in 2002,
sure.
There were calls for not to call another election soon, because
sure.
the environment was completely polarized. A lot of Muslims had left their homes.
Sure.
These were calls coming in that there shouldn't be any election pretty soon. But your uncle, who was appointed as a special advisor to Gujarat back then, had actually given a clean chit to Narendra Modi. So to what extent you see him as someone who played a role into the ascendance of Modi?
So two things here. One is, let us separate the two things. I had huge, even when he was alive, huge disagreements with any view that he had on Modi or the clean chit. But the second thing that happened in Gujarat, and for this I will go back to Sri Kumar himself, the man who was this. In his role as special advisor, the first day without violence in Gujarat of communal violence on the ground was when KPS Gill took over. Sri Kumar says that normal policing returned to Punjab when Gill came and took over. What happened? PC Pandey gets posted out when KPS Gill comes. Officers who were colluding in the violence were posted out. Good officers were put in place. That was changed after he moved out of Gujarat, and Modi rewarded the bad officers and went systematically after good officers. It's true in the later period, because in that 2 months, the violence stopped. And people like Sri Kumar, who have been the greatest critics of Modi, have specifically on record said normal policing returned to Gujarat the day KPS Gill took over. These are facts again on the ground, and I'm not picking. Does that justify the clean chit to Modi or the later support to Modi, saying that Modi is not responsible in any way? No, not at all. So one is the role as a police officer. One is the lessons he takes out of it and speaks about later. No, I have no agreement with those.
But although I do remember a conversation I had with Mr. Gill when he was appointed as special advisor to Gujarat, and I had a chance to interview him for radio. And I pointedly asked him this question, that the people who were accused of burning the Sabarmati Rail Express, they were charged for quota under an anti-terrorism law, whereas the people who went after those innocent Muslims, people from the Hindutva groups, they were never charged for quota. So how do you defend that? And he just said, you know what, the quota does not apply on the people you are referring to. So how problematic was that answer in your understanding?
Sure, no, I have no agreements with that answer. Absolutely. I don't have agreements with quota itself or its use. Absolutely.
Right. Well, Tosh, it was nice talking to you. I didn't ask you.
No, I think that covers everything. See, the question is, what I want to point out is that we keep returning to these conversations over and over again. As I said, that there is a place and time where we must discuss Punjab in its totality, its brutality from all sides and what happened there. And let us face up to it. That the truth about Punjab will not be created simply by saying a person was responsible and this is what happened during that period.
Hmm.
We will never confront what really happened in Punjab. And what happened in Punjab did not only happen to Sikhs or Sikhs were taken up arms. There is also a story of the Hindus, the migrants, every part of Punjab was affected at that point of time. And that truth has to be discussed in its broadest reality and put on board. It will involve many conflicting narratives, many disagreements, even between you and me and people who come to the table. And if you are not going to put that truth out and deal with it honestly, we will always be caught up in binaries where there will be one view of the Indian state and one view of some people sitting in Canada. And this debate over the truth of what really happened will go away because we are not talking with facts and evidence on the ground with field work. That is the most important thing, the honesty to be able to take up these questions. And people, I have said that obviously I will come to this discussion with biases of my own. Nobody gets uninfluenced by people they have known closely, grown up with, and are close to. And I put that on the table, but then everybody must put down what they have on the table as they talk about this. A large part of the Sikh community, including people in Canada, I have served in the armed forces themselves, have relatives in the armed forces or the police themselves, or have been in these police forces. These people have been participants in exactly this whole systemic violation. Yeah. Within their families, have they spoken up? Have they spoken about what happens when they are party to what is happening? Do they ask for this accountability? Do they examine as a community the involvement in the Sikhs in terms of recruitment into the army and the police forces systematically in the kind of system that the Indian state has designed? Of course, these are realities that we deal with all the time. And that is the reality of Punjab. That is the reality of India as a country. We are a brutal country which cannot live up to the promise of the constitution and the reality that exists on the ground. That is one part of the question. And I think that part of the question needs to be dealt with separately at a huge level as a separate discussion. But if that is going to be the benchmark against which every issue relating to Punjab or every issue relating to India is going to be discussed again, because some people want their voices to be the ultimate arbiter of the truth, then you're really not having a discussion and openness with which things will proceed. Again, today, as we've seen, this was supposed to be about the farm protests. That it becomes a question of divisions within the community, questions about what happened in the 80s, is because this is where we choose to take it, or that is where some people want to take it. Addressing this question or changing it, silencing me from speaking about the farm protests, will that change the reality? Will it help them mold their idea of what happened in the 80s in India? And how does that affect the farm protests? Will you go to every farmer in the farm protests from Haryana and UP, including many from Punjab, and get them to agree with their version of events? Are those farmers going to necessarily agree with the view of some Canadians sitting there on KPS Gill or Punjab or the Khalistan movement? Will any of them participate in the farm protests only when this clarification has been given by them to some people? And who are these some people? What is their stake? On what basis are they examining? As I've said, they don't even understand the facts. They don't understand what really happened. They don't know the numbers. They are raising issues and they are unable to make the arguments. The arguments against what happened in Punjab are strong enough, but they cannot be made by lies and exaggeration. That is all.
Now I will request Charlie and Rishi to join in the discussion.
Okay.
And if you feel free to raise questions if you have.
Okay, I was very interested at the start, Hartosh, when you were talking about the problems of COVID in India right now, and I'm curious. In the United States, the COVID crisis really brought down President Donald Trump, and I'm wondering if you think there's any chance that this could put a dent in Modi and the BJP over time as the situation deteriorates.
Look, it's very difficult to make any assessment at this point of time. Yes, there is far more public criticism of Mr. Modi than we have seen in the past. But we've seen past disasters. Of course, this is on a totally entirely different scale, including demonetization, which hit the poor, where the currency was devalued overnight. The poor were hit, a lot of people were hit, and it gave him huge, enormous popularity. Mr. Modi and his control over the media give them enormous ability to spin things to their advantage. We will only know what happens as we come out of it. The problem here and the difference between Trump and Modi is that the support for Modi is far deeper, far more entrenched, and the weakness of the systems that question Modi is far greater than in the US. There are institutionally nobody's standing up and pointing out where the problems are. Of pointing out where this government has failed, what it has not done. So in a large sense, its ability to continue to deceive the media about, or the people themselves about what they have failed to do is enormous. So I think it will make a dent. To what extent that dent will push him out of power or raise questions, I do not know. I remain skeptical, having seen the influence of Modi on the ground and this vast Hindu nationalist majority from the right wing, the RSS that backs him, that it would be too early to say that this would be something that would destroy Modi or ensure that he's voted out of power.
Okay.
Any other question, Charlie?
Yeah, I thought I saw a question from Rishi, but I could ask another question. Do you want to ask a question, Rishi?
Rishi has just, sent in his question in written, but if he doesn't want to ask, I can ask on his behalf. So basically, Rishi wants to know, how has the cancellation of your lecture on farm laws in Canada helped New Delhi? This is his question, Hartosh.
Look, I don't think in that sense, whatever importance, I mean, people in British Columbia, the one who proposed it, may give it, that I don't think one way or the other it makes much difference to the Modi government whether the farm laws get taken up in Canada or not. The ability to amplify voices outside, to take up the issues related to the farm laws in a coherent, rational manner, and get them amplified in the international media and have voices speaking on it, that actually influences the Modi government itself. So to ensure that reasoned, rational arguments against the farm laws don't happen, certainly suits the Modi government. I mean, to that extent, they would be happy to suppress. I mean, it's not individual. Anybody who speaks critically of the farm laws, makes some rational reasoned arguments against the farm laws, will be questioned. The Modi government would not want them to speak, and they gain from that, stopping them from speaking.
Apparently, Rishi is on the speech fast, I believe. So he wants me to ask another question. He writes, the farmers have been sitting at the borders of Delhi for the last 5 months. How long do you think can this deadlock go on?
Look, the deadlock may, first of all, I mean, there's the immediate COVID crisis. The COVID crisis was used by the Indian government, by the Modi government, to destroy the NRC protests last year when they saw it as an opportunity and used it. The second, so I think they will try and use that opportunity as well. But right now, immediately, we have election results coming out from West Bengal, Assam, etc., 3 more states. The results will be crucial if I think the Modi government wins or sweeps despite the pandemic. I think they will take a hardened position on the farm laws itself. It is also something we have to realize that Punjab and Haryana politically do not matter much to the Modi government. Their real worry is whether the farmers of Western UP can influence Western UP enough to make a dent in the UP elections next year. There are panchayat elections happening in UP right now where the BJP is going to do well. They are going to use that against the farmers, that they don't even have control over local panchayats and they are going to teach us lessons. So these are the kind of spins that will, there will be questions about COVID. Some of the strategy of the farmers movement will have to be rethought. The march into Delhi that was scheduled for the end of this month and next month, under the current circumstances, is not, it does not help the cause. Delhi is today in such a state that popular demonstration on the street about farm laws at this moment will not be uppermost in anybody's mind. It will not ring well with the population. So the farmers have to wait out the current movement, stay strong on the ground, they have the ability in the past. We know that farm protests have gone on for much longer than these 5 months, but these circumstances are exceptional. So one is the use of COVID itself by the government. The second is the intransigence of the government. They will not want to see themselves as giving in to the farmers. Put that together, I think this deadlock is not going to be resolved anytime soon unless some sort of compromise is agreed in which both sides can be shown as saving face. But that is also going to be very difficult for both sides because the farm leaders have come with a certain mandate and a certain support of the people with certain expectations.
Charlie, you have another question?
Well, I'm curious about if you could talk about the role of the RSS vis-a-vis the BJP and Modi, and often it's presented in Canada as almost the BJP is a wing of the RSS. And then I wonder, but then Modi is this strong man. Is there someone in the RSS? Like, how does that work? We're not familiar with that here in Canada, something like this.
See, look, I mean, and I'll just take a bit more time because the RSS is a difficult organization to understand from the outside and people tend to understand it through parallels. But look, the RSS, and we are at a very critical juncture, was founded in 1925. 2025 is going to be the centenary of the RSS. We tend to compare it with fascist organizations across the world. Actually, it is far more pernicious and dangerous, of course. None of the fascist movements in Europe have had the legs to last 100 years and continuously grow decade after decade without fail through that period of existence, to the point where they've been able to take over an entire society and subvert it from within. So in that sense, the RSS is a force with its slow expansion from what they call local shakhas, local wings where people come and perform some fancy calisthenics in uniforms, which has a certain fascist order to it, are ordered through this allegiance to the Shakha, going through a 2 or 3 year course where they have to travel to the RSS headquarters and clear the course before they become pracharaks or preachers of the RSS. And slowly this organization, which started with very clear anti-Muslim and anti-Christian, basically views strongly against people of faiths which originate outside India. So in that sense, they want to keep the Sikhs and the Buddhists on their side. The Christians and Muslims are their enemies and always deserve second-class status in any Hindu nation that they will design, has slowly expanded to its work into every aspect of Indian society. Which such organization in the world today has one of India's biggest farm unions, which is obviously not part of these protests, one of India's biggest trade unions, the largest network of schools among India's indigenous population, where they work to bring these indigenous populations into the fold of Hinduism as they would like it. Schools spread across various systems, labor unions. Name any part of Indian society today, the RSS extends to it. The BJP in that sense really is just the political wing of the RSS. Every great amplification of the BJP's power has required the RSS workers continuously working on the ground in those periods. Modi in that sense is a departure from the RSS tradition. They do not like a personality cult. But you must remember that in the period from 2014 to 2020-21, Modi has been born out of the RSS. He himself went through the same system I've described. He's always owed allegiance to the RSS. He's never stepped outside the ideological confines of the RSS. Through this period, the so-called successes in their own terms of the Modi administration are the only successes they have to boast of are the successes the RSS most wanted. What is that? The destruction of the special status of Kashmir, the building of a temple after the destruction of a mosque in Ayodhya, a citizenship law that discriminates. These are the major issues on which the Modi government has actually succeeded in laying down legislation. This is exactly what the RSS wants. So while Modi is a personality cult, he has never traveled or moved outside the confines of the core issues that the RSS wants for this country. What Modi will usher in 2025, and one must pay attention to this, that this is where we are headed. The next election is in 2024, but the date we must keep in mind is 2025. I see that in some ways, the 100 years of the RSS will see the consecration of India as a Hindu nation. This roughly is where we are headed to.
Rishi has another question. He wants to know what is the future of the farmers' agitation and the Modi government. He wants me to ask all these questions. He doesn't want to speak.
Look, I really don't know. I mean, in the sense that journalists are not
Astrologers.
we are unable to say what is going to happen. I think that this is a necessary movement. Personally, I think the sooner the Modi government ends, the better it is for India. But is that what is going to happen? I'm in no position to answer or say.
Charlie, another question? Are you good?
Yeah, I think I'm good. Thank you, Gurpreet. Thank you, Hartosh. This is very enlightening.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks for joining in.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you again, Rishi ji, for your
Thank you,
participation
sir. Thank you.
and raising those important questions.
Thank you, Hartosh ji. ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਵੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Hartosh, any final words before we let you go?
No, nothing. I think we've spoken about everything. That's all that matters. And I guess the idea as a journalist is to continue speaking on issues. There's no conversation that is the last thing on anything.
Yeah.
So.
Definitely. And currency is something which is very important.
Thanks, Gurpreet, for moderating.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Rishi.
Gurpreet ji.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Hartosh.
Gurpreet ji.
Talk to you again.
Okay, thanks.
Thank
So long.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Bye for now.
Okay.